It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for him.
Strange New Worlds Episode Review. I would like the review to go now. Welcome, my friends. We're gathered here today to discuss Star Trek Strange New Worlds once again. Season 2 is dropped. We are at Episode 1 entitled The Broken Circle. But before I get too far into the actual episode, since it's been a little while and since this is going to be a continuation of Season 1, obviously, I do just want to lay out a couple of things. So my impressions of Season 1 were pretty good. It wouldn't be necessarily my favorite Star Trek show, but I did think it was a pretty strong first season of a Star Trek show. A lot of times they stumble in the first season. This is a 10-episode season. So when you have a TNG era show that's got 24 episodes, even if 8 of those episodes are utter garbage, you're still probably going to have a pretty good overall feeling of the show. If you have a 10-episode season and only 4 of those episodes are garbage, that's a much larger percentage of the whole, and that's probably going to influence the way you feel about the show a lot more strongly. So they really, really need to hit it out of the park with these 10 episodes in order to give you that long-lasting good feeling of the season. Whether or not you liked Season 1 is probably going to be indicative of your feelings here, because they were already almost finished with the filming of Season 2 before we got to see the entire Series 1, which means there was no time to really adjust to fan criticism or fan complaints or, even the good things that fans had to say. So there's probably not going to be that much of a change between seasons as far as addressing any issues you may have had. Overall, I thought this was a very bold choice as the introductory episode of the season. It didn't address very much the lingering leftovers from Season 1 where Una was arrested and going on trial for her genetically enhanced status. That was mentioned right off the bat, so Una and Pike were talking. She's still under arrest, under guard, whatever. Her trial's coming up. Pike took a newfangled shuttle, to speed off a 2.5-day mission in order to pick up a lawyer or something for her, and that's it. That's the entirety of that storyline. We don't see Una, we don't see Pike for the rest of the episode. This is a Spock, Mbenga, and Chapel primarily centric episode because Spock is put in charge. They are at Space Dock. They were having some refits. We get to meet Palia here, who is the new chief engineer. Sort of. Now, if you watch my video on here, I will link that if you haven't. I thought that there could be some potential issues with this character replacing Hemmer outright, and us as the audience knowing that Scotty is coming up. So what was she going to do? How is she going to fit in? I thought that maybe she would be a temporary replacement, some higher up in Starfleet or something like that, just being on temporary loan for the Enterprise until they got a real new chief engineer. And it turns out that's fairly similar to what actually happens in the episode. She is on the ship doing a refit service, doing some sort of inspection tour, and it turns out that the crux of this episode is La'an, who had left the ship last season, sends a distress call while they're in Space Dock, while they're getting these repairs, and the crew needs to put together this daring plan to steal the Enterprise and go out into the cosmos and try to figure out what's going on, because they are told by Robert April they are not to go. It was fun to see Spock in command for the first time chronologically, I suppose, which leads me to a bit of a down. I'm not 100% on board with the way they're treating Spock so far in this show. I like him, I like the actor, I do like what he's bringing to the character, but I don't enjoy the fact that they're treating him a little bit more like a teenager, I suppose, somebody who's still getting used to himself and his skin. He's overtly emotional, and they deal with this in this episode, saying that when he had to take down all of his mental blocks back to fight the Gorn in Season 1, he is no longer able to control his emotions. And while that is a plausible explanation, it feels sort of like a retread of what we saw with T'Pol in Enterprise when she lost her Vulcan inhibitions due to the Trellium-D poisoning. So it just feels like they're giving Spock flaws and they're giving Spock these emotions simply because they want that to be the character instead of treating him as the character he was in TOS. And that isn't necessarily a negative 100% of the time. I'm just not always on board with the way they're treating him. And a similar situation is shown when Mbenga gives him the Vulcan Loot. Just feels like that Star Wars syndrome where every little piece of the universe needs to be given a backstory, needs to be given an explanation. And I don't think that's necessarily adding to the canon in a significant way. We could have just assumed that Spock picked it up while he was on Vulcan as a child and he learned to play it there, but now we're given that moment in history. That canonization of how Spock got the loot is now canonized throughout Star Trek, and it just feels like we didn't need that. There was no need to have that specific element added to the canon. And we get to see there's definitely a burgeoning romance. We saw that in season 1 going on with Chapel and Spock. They're ultimately going to culminate that somehow this season. I'm not entirely sure how. Maybe it'll be during a Pon farr moment, or maybe it'll be, because of the situation he's dealing with, his loss of emotional control, they will hook up, and that will eventually end poorly because we know they don't necessarily end up together. So it's just filling in these gaps with things we know won't last. That kind of feels like we're treading water and wasting a little bit of time, even though it does feel genuine and it does impact the emotional stakes of the season and the episode. It just, in the long term, we know it's not going to last, so how much investment can we really have in it? We also, as I mentioned, get Palia here. I do like her. I like her status as an alien.
You're Lanthanite.
Guilty as charged.
And it's not necessarily an alien we've seen before, so that was another thing. I really wanted to see more alien representation in Star Trek. I was thinking specifically of Legacy, but here they introduce her as an alien. Yes, she is a human-presenting alien, so that doesn't involve any fancy prosthetics. She does have an interesting accent, and she does have an interesting backstory, which potentially ties to Spock's mother. And that's interesting. I'm not sure how that'll play out. I've said before, I don't necessarily like how they're tying all of these new Star Trek characters into Spock's family and Spock's lineage, but I could see this potentially adding a fun element because she is, as she mentions later, functionally immortal or somewhat immortal. I'm not entirely sure how that works. It hasn't been explained. I am interested to see how that works. Her species was living in secret on Earth up until the 22nd century when they were finally discovered and finally outed themselves. And I'm wondering if that might play into the time travel episode we know is going to happen later on this season. Could it be similar to a Guinan situation? Well, first of all, Guinan was on Earth earlier, so was this a whole network of aliens on Earth at the time interacting with each other, knowing that there's also other aliens on Earth? So that could be interesting. But will this be similar to a Time Zero situation when, as we know, La'an and James T. Kirk travel back to what appears to be current day or roughly current day Earth? Could it be that they meet up with the Palia living on Earth at that time, and she helps them fix the future, get back to the future, whatever you want to say? So I'm going to throw that out there right now and assume maybe they're setting it up so that she could become a key component of that later on. After they steal the Enterprise, they go to find La'an. It's on this border planet that was important during the Klingon War. It's a dilithium mining planet, so they've got this strange agreement with the Klingons where they take turns on the planet. So sometimes the Federation uses it, sometimes the Klingons uses it, and they're supplying dilithium to both sides. So that's an interesting concept. I don't hate that idea. One thing, and I don't hate this at all, but why did sci-fi explicitly determine that alien worlds need to be represented by strange rock formations, hanging rocks in the air, big structures of rock? I mean, it's cool. That might be the default answer in showing an alien world, probably because of Avatar, so thanks again, James Cameron. We also get our first look in this series of the head bump Klingons, the more TNG motion picture era Klingons that we haven't seen since, well, apparently Worf and Picard Season 3, but they weren't the ones that appeared in Discovery. However, there was an interesting mix where it looks like they were kind of cobbling together the two looks, and I don't hate that. I never really liked the monstrosity look of the Discovery-era Klingons, but to add a little extra flair, to add a little more detail to the Klingons, isn't 100% negative in my opinion. That's what I do want to address. The Klingon storyline, while interesting, had M'Benga and Nurse Chapel going undercover basically to figure out what's happening. They get captured by the Klingon faction to heal them up, and they determine there is a crashed Starfleet ship, a Starfleet vessel, Another iffy moment, they kept referring to these things as Federation ships and Federation vessels. And now I know Starfleet is under the Federation, but it seemed odd. Like, why wouldn't they call this a Starfleet vessel or a Starfleet ship? It just seemed a little odd that they kept referring to it as a Federation ship. I know that's a minor nitpick, but it stood out to me. And I think this is going to lead to an eventual decision we know is coming down the line. But we find out that M'Benga was involved in the Klingon War pretty heavily. Now, whether or not this involves Section 31, I don't know, but he has some sort of temporary super soldier serum that he can take. It's a green liquid, and it gives him and Nurse Chapel, they both take it, and they both seem to be well on board with what it is. They know exactly what it is without having to talk. So it seems like this is something that's happened before. It gives them superpowers, the ability to just beat the crap out of Klingons, take them down, no prisoners, whatever. There must be some downsides. There must be some long-lasting impact here, because why haven't we seen this before unless there are severe side effects? It seems like that might be treading on the genetic manipulation line, which doesn't fall in line with the whole ban on that, so are we going to see a connection there? I don't know. Is it going to come back into play? I have to imagine, though, this is going to inevitably be the reason why M'Benga leaves the ship, steps down, gets shunted aside, and is replaced as the chief medical officer in lieu of Bones. Now, we know he is on the ship at least a couple of episodes in the original series. Maybe his PTSD, his drug addiction, his whatever we're going with here, leads to him no longer being competent enough to be the chief medical officer. I really don't like the superpower thing in Star Trek. Obviously, some species are stronger than others. I just don't like the idea of our Starfleet characters being able to take a super soldier serum. Now, obviously, if it's connected to Section 31, I'm going to hate it even more, but that remains to be seen. It's adding some interesting backstory to somebody who in season 1 had the trauma of his daughter. Now he's going to deal with the trauma of the war and this drug addiction, perhaps. So it looks like they're planning a deep, layered analysis of Dr. M'Benga here. It felt kind of disconnected. It felt like the scenes at the beginning stealing the Enterprise, the scene with Spock coming up with his catchphrase was a bit overdone, in my opinion. I think that in Star Trek in general isn't something they really need to be doing anymore. But it just felt like a lot of fun, interesting, well thought out ideas that didn't really come together and connect into a relatively coherent story. I felt a lot of the components were fun, but they didn't build a mechanism that worked, in my opinion. I did like seeing a lot of the CG elements. I did like a lot of the acting. I liked some of the character interplay. As I mentioned, I like seeing these versions of the Klingons. I just don't feel that it came together as a perfect, coherent, end-to-end storyline. It felt like kind of like several vignettes stitched together into an episode that was kind of bookended by the Starfleet stuff. And I just don't know if that was a great way to start out the season. It was a bold choice not starting it out with the Una situation, and it was a bold choice starting out the season without, arguably, the main character of the show himself, Anson Mount's Captain Mike. Anson Mount's Captain Pike. So I'm wondering if this season's going to be a lot more broken out into individual storylines, and we're not going to get that entire crew working together type situation. Oh, I forgot to mention, they bring in a Crossfield class ship. Now, this is the class of ship Discovery was. I could have sworn there were only 2 of those in service in Starfleet. Maybe I'm misremembering and there was only 2 of them equipped with the spore drive, but there were other classes of that ship out there. One thing I do want to point out, though, when our characters do take out that ship at the end of the episode, I think chronologically, this is the first Crossfield ship to get those detachable nacelles, so I'm sorry, Discovery, you now lose that honor. The other big piece of ongoing storyline we're dropped in this episode is there seems to be an air of something sinister coming inside Starfleet. Now, this is mentioned by Pike when he has that conversation with April, and we get further confirmation, further elaboration on this at the end with Robert April and another admiral or commodore or somebody. I'm not sure they ever gave his name, so forgive me. But basically, He's talking about a war that's looming, a war that's coming, and it appears this is going to be with the Gorn. They are playing the Gorn as the main nemesis, the main enemy of this series, or at least this season and the first season, and I don't know how I feel about that. I'm one of the few people that's probably okay with them slightly bending canon. I know the Gorn weren't supposed to be introduced until the TOS era. However, it wasn't somebody that they ever really used in Star Trek. It was primarily a one-off episode villain that was then brought back in an alternate reality in Enterprise, and of course they threw them in the lower decks and stuff like that too. So to flesh them out, I feel is a good thing. The way they're fleshing them out, I am not 100% on board with. I don't like that they've turned them into these sinister, alien-esque monsters that are hunting people and breeding inside the body. I just don't necessarily like that. I think they should be treated a bit more respectfully, like an empire in the stars that's got superior intellect, but they're doing things differently because they are a reptilian race, so they don't think of things on the same terms as us. The cultures don't mesh very well, so there's just this vast disconnect between them. And as the books fleshed out, there are different sects and different types of Gorn who evolved differently to serve vastly different functions within the hegemony. So whether or not they're going to introduce that into the show, I don't know. But the Gorn we've seen on screen so far don't appear to be that intelligent, and they seem to be this creepy, swarming race of sinister monsters, and I don't like that. I want them to actually be the advanced spacefaring race that we know they have to be in order to propagate themselves throughout the stars. That remains to be seen. We haven't seen them yet in this season. Like I said, that could just be one version of the Gorn. That could just be the attack dog version of the Gorn, and there's still a hyper-intelligent command sector or whatever out there. But those are some of my thoughts for this episode. At the end of the day, I did like a lot of this episode. I just don't feel that it was put together correctly. I don't feel a lot of the pieces fit with each other, and I think it was just a lot of good ideas mixed in with some questionable ideas, just thrown together in something that didn't feel like a substantial enough premiere to a new season. Hopefully next episode's going to be great. I have to imagine they're finally going to be getting to the Pike and Una storyline, and maybe in episode 3 everyone finally comes back together. So I'm definitely looking forward to this season, but I don't think that this was the best start it could have possibly had. What did you think? Did you like this episode? Do you like Strange New Worlds overall? Any thoughts? Anything that I missed? Anything I got wrong? What do you think of Palia and her kind of side story? What do you think about Mbenga? As always, leave all those thoughts below. I have a coffee if you want to throw me some money. Apparently, YouTube changed their stuff, and 500 subscribers allows me to monetize myself, even though they haven't let me yet. So all of those fancy YouTube things are down below, supposedly. We'll see if that comes through. Leave a like, do a share, all those things. Tell me all about it. But until next time...